Can't hear you.
Still can't hear you.
Well, maybe I should do that. All right. Thank you for indulging me with that official start. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Coates, for those who don't know me, and welcome to the Richmond, Central Virginia IONS Community Group meeting for May 20th, 2023. We need to move this up?
Yeah.
All right.
Need to lean in.
Okay. All right. Am I being heard all right?
Yes.
Here and on Zoom? Okay. As most of you know from hearing me say it every month, IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, is an organization that was founded in 1973 by Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Mitchell was the Apollo lunar landing module pilot for Apollo 14. And after his walk on the moon, he had a transcendent experience on the way back to Earth, a unity consciousness experience. As he looked out of the window of the Apollo vessel and saw the pale blue dot that was Earth that they were headed towards, and he resolved at that moment that he wanted to spend the rest of his life exploring the frontiers of consciousness, especially those which the interface between science and spirit. And so the Institute of Noetic Sciences was created as a vehicle for that by Edgar Mitchell in the summer of 1973, and it has still exists in headquartered in Petaluma, California today. It has spawned many community groups around the United States and around the world, mostly in the English-speaking world, but not exclusively. And we have been blessed in Richmond to have had one of the most vibrant and robust community groups in the whole global network, and we're now in our 28th year, I guess. We're headed towards our 28th anniversary next January, having been in existence since January 1996, and we've been blessed to have both active participation from people in person, and since COVID came along, to have people coming online, both locally who still hold up for COVID and those who have joined us from afar. And that's expanded our reach for speakers and so forth. So it's been all around. COVID turned out to be a positive thing for our group, even though it was a very difficult situation for all concerned. I would also mention that in our group, we've survived only by the donations of those who show up. Those who show up, we consider our members. The only criteria for being a member is showing up, whether it's here in person or online. For those who show up in person, we pass a basket with love offerings, and we invite you to reach into your heart and your wallet, and where the two meet, put that in the basket and be as generous as you can. For those who are online, you can make donations to us through our PayPal function. And if you're not comfortable with that, as some people are not, you can always send a check to Richmond IONS to the address on the email that comes to you each month with the monthly flyer, which is my office address. And so we appreciate all you can do, because that's only through those donations that we are able to survive and continue bringing you the monthly programs and the wonderful speakers that we have, almost without exception. And so thank you very much on that. We also, as most of you know, have embarked on a second series that is on the, instead of the third Saturday morning of each month, it's on the on the first Wednesday evening of each month, from 7 to 8:30. It's on Zoom only. And this is something that our steering committee member, Susanna Calvert, has initiated in collaboration with a group that she founded called Sanctuary of Earth. It's primarily about spiritual practices, and there have been some wonderful presentations on there. The one coming up on the first Wednesday of June, which is June the 7th, is a woman named Judy Keating, and the flyer for that will be going out probably next week. In any event, what other announcements do we have?
Oh, hey, Tom, there's a group of 7 or 8 people that are in another Zoom room that was assigned by Meetup. So I just lucked out that I was able to find your email with the other link. So you've got about half your audience somewhere else.
Dan, how do we deal with that?
So the meetup should have the login to this Zoom meeting.
That sounds like I posted the wrong one. So sorry.
Is there some way of us reaching that group or no?
Maybe go log in and.
Yeah, why don't you try doing that, Susanna? Huh?
Send them the correct meeting link.
You need the meeting number for this one?
Yeah, I have it on slide.
Here you go.
So sorry.
Well, yeah, who was it? Can you say who spoke up on that?
Yeah, it's Mark. I just happened to click on, normally I always click on your email, but
Okay.
because of the calendar, I clicked on the Meetup email link instead. And it was a totally different room, and there's 7 people in there.
Mark, is there a chance that you could go into that room again and give them the correct ID number and passcode for this meeting?
Yeah, I think so. Is the Meetup organizer in the room that can just like revise the Meetup announcement? But that's because it only affects those that are already in there, that not those that come in late. But yeah, I can do that.
All right, well, let me get the ID number is 865-1815-1952, and the passcode is 142841. Really appreciate it.
That's what's in your email. So I'll just copy what's in your email and see if I can chat it into their room and come back.
Okay. Thank you very much for speaking up. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known. And thank you for helping to correct it.
We need a treasurer too. We need a treasurer as well.
Oh yeah, I want to announce again. We've announced this a couple of times. Sally Youngs, who has been our treasurer for more than 15 years, has gone into retirement. Unfortunately, we tried to persuade her to not do that, but she insisted on doing it anyway. And so we are very anxious to find someone to take her place. And if anyone is interested in being the treasurer of our organization, which takes a little bit of time, but it's a rewarding pursuit, not financially, but there will be many rewards in heaven for those who do it. And so we hope that we'll have more than one person volunteering, and we'll have a runoff to see who gets the position. I think that's all we have for now, but Linda Childs, the wife of our speaker today, is going to give the opening meditation, and then after that, I will introduce our speaker.
So I'm going to assume that everybody everywhere can hear me. I don't have a lot to say. What I'm going to do is use this bowl as a device by which we can move ourselves first into stillness, secondary into silence, and then into spaciousness. So if you could all find a comfortable position with your feet on the floor, your hands in your lap, and close your eyes. And I'm going to invite us all to be still and know that I am God. And as your body settles into the stillness, bring yourself here to this room, to this time and place. Begin to feel your breathing coming from your heart space. And listen for the sound of silence. In that silence, imagine the energy of your breath as it channels through your heart, bringing with it the peace and quiet of the spaciousness without and your spaciousness within as you follow the sound of the bell. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. What?
Skip the part about it.
Wait, what?
In my bio, skip over the intel intelligence.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Our speaker today has been a member of our group for 9 or 10 years, I think. He and I met for the first time not at the Monroe Institute proper, but at one of the homes on what Bob Monroe referred to as the New Land, where he had taken a part of the 850-acre Roberts Mountain farm and used it to subdivide for hoping that he would have a very advanced spiritual community up there. It didn't work out exactly as he had planned, but nevertheless, there were some very interesting people there. And there was a couple named Georgia and Ed Pearson who would hold monthly meetings for a number of years. They both moved on to the next dimension now, but Georgia would do a monthly channeling, and the group that would convene there were referred to as the Lafayetians, and it was a really interesting group of people. And the first time I went there, I met Robert, I met Tom Hansen, and both have been closely associated with I'm proud to say and very pleased to say they have been very closely associated with our community group ever since. Robert has given a couple of talks in the past. They've been among the most engaging we've ever had. He is quite a scholar. He told me just now, I'm sort of deaf, and so I couldn't hear very well, but he instructed me to skip over some of the parts of his bio that are too secret to be known about. But in any event, He gave us a wonderful talk on exopolitics some years ago, and then another one on remote viewing. And he had been trained in the program up there, but they closed it down before he ever engaged. In any event, he is one of the most well-informed people I've ever known, and he seems to have spent much of his life trying to get over the early programming he had as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, and so I would say he's done extremely well in that regard, and he's here today to tell us all about God, which is a subject that's near and dear to every one of us because we're all part of that energy. So without further ado, I welcome Robert Bushman as our speaker today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Overly generous, as usual. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Just wave your hands if you can't hear me. I'll try to speak up. I recognize that my title today is a bit presumptuous, but it's just marketing, just to pique your interest. I really can't answer this question. It's the great mystery, after all. We'd all like to know. The best I can offer you today is to try to trace the origin of our common conception of God. And I'll probably end up with, as a conclusion, what God is not, for what it's worth. Just want to connect a few of these dots to trace the idea of God in our cultural heritage. That term is so fraught and understood so differently by so many, it's almost useless to be understood clearly. So the idea of God that I'll work with here is one in which God is a person, human-like in form, all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, and the creator of all. Rather than examine that definition, however, my purpose is simply to trace the origin of that idea, because I think it would be important to our understanding of how it's used commonly. So to begin with, I'm going to start with Jesus, and then work backward into the Old Testament, from there to Sumer, and see what we find there. And our ambient Christian culture has gotten its idea of God mainly from the New Testament, Jesus. So who did Jesus say was God? Yeah, I got a little slideshow. Let's see if it works. As usual, it's always a tussle with the tech here. Let's don't use PowerPoint. Okay. Very good. All right. I think we're in business now. Okay. Don't touch any more buttons. Okay. There we go. Here's my overview. So, Jesus was undeniably an extraordinary figure, so it's well that we should trouble ourselves to get clear about his message. Over recent decades, there's been much interest by scholars in establishing the so-called historical Jesus, that is, getting a factual description of him and his message, in distinction to the large body of unsupported traditional belief that has grown up around him over the ages. So the main source of information that we have is, of course, the New Testament, supposedly written by those who were his followers and heard his message. It's this record that modern Christianity bases its understanding of God. In the New Testament record, Jesus actually does not talk about God explicitly. He does not use that term, but he does speak of Father. The issue then is, when Jesus said Father, did he mean God? And did he mean Father as a literal person? As the New Testament scholar James Robison puts it, we must concern ourselves with working it out if we do not wish ultimately to find ourselves committed to a mythological Lord. And my next slide. Yes, is corrupted, so I'll just read you what it was supposed to say. So Jesus used the term Father a lot. For example, our Father which art in heaven, he that doeth the will of my Father. No man knoweth the Son but the Father. I and my Father are one. Glorify your Father which is in heaven. Angels do always behold the face of my Father. I must be about the business of my Father, etc., etc. There are many more mentions of Father. One would easily get the impression, my slides are not moving. Dan, any idea why my slide? Here we go. Here we go. I got it.
You're not in a direct line anymore.
Oh, okay. I'll let you move them for me then. I'll just say click. One would easily get the impression from all these mentions of Father that he meant God as an actual person. And that is where common Christian theology has gone. So we have great respect for Jesus, but we need to know how we are to understand his sayings. To start with, we need to understand how reliable the record of Jesus is. So what did Jesus mean by Father? I hate to break it to you, but he never said Father. Father, you see, is an English word, and he spoke Aramaic. So Father is a translation of whatever he said. Now, this issue is not trivial. Let's look at whether the Aramaic word for Father would land on the ears of his followers at their time and place, like the word Father lands on our ears in our time and place. Are the two exact equivalent? And what difference in their meaning is possible? Let me propose an example from English. Here's the example. Robert Oppenheimer is the father of Sarah Braunstein. There's no doubt in our mind that's a literal meaning of father, right? How about this? Robert Oppenheimer is the father of the atom bomb. So there's no doubt in our mind that the sense of the word father in this case is metaphoric. These are two obviously very different senses of meaning, and we need to know which is which in order to understand. In this figurative sense of the term, we have possible meanings of source, creator, mentor, origin, author, originator, inventor, architect, designer, guide, etc. So how do we know whether Jesus was engaging in metaphor when he used the term Father? We judge which is which, literal or figurative, against the context or background of our belief in the nature of reality. Sometimes we're absolutely sure, other times we just guess. even without knowing that we're guessing, because we're so sure that we understand reality. Consider this: the average vocabulary of an Aramaic speaker at the time is estimated to be around 7,000 words. The average reading vocabulary of an educated speaker of English is estimated to be around 40,000 words, about 3 times as large. What this means is that when there may not be a precise word in Aramaic to express the desired meaning, then a metaphor would be employed using whatever word may suggest the intended meaning. And in fact, the word father in Aramaic is indeed used far more metaphorically than our word father is in English. Because we have so many other words available that are more explicit. So did Jesus use his word for father as a metaphor for something other than a personal God? It's notable that Jesus is not said to have used a term for God. It may be that speaking such a term was forbidden to the Jews at the time, or perhaps there's some other reason, but nevertheless, Christian culture today takes Jesus to mean God when speaking of Father. Furthermore, that God is taken in common Christianity to be the one spoken of in the Old Testament. To look at the Father God issue, let's first look at the reliability issue of the New Testament. And here I've listed 12 points to consider in the reliability issue of the New Testament. So number 1, they were not written, the Gospels were not written by Jesus. Nothing in the Gospels was written by Jesus himself. He didn't even edit or approve what was written. All of what was written in the Gospels was written by others. The technical term for this type of evidence is hearsay. I have some experience with news reporters quoting what I have said in their articles on the basis of notes that they took while I was speaking. I have no doubt that they believed they were reporting accurately. There was no reason for them to do otherwise. However, when the story came out in print, the facts were inevitably skewed in some ways. This is essentially why our commonly accepted legal standards of reliability exclude hearsay evidence. Number 2, the Gospels were not written by the actual witnesses. They were not on-the-spot transcriptions of Jesus' teachings. They were written after the fact, not later that day, not the next day, but 60 to 100 years, 120 years later. Given that the average lifespan of a person at the time was around 40 years, it's highly improbable that the Gospels were written by anyone who actually heard Jesus speak. Number 3, time degrades memory. So the teachings of Jesus as we have them were apparently passed on from those who heard him to others who held those retellings in their memory. How much credibility should we put in the accuracy of that memory? We grant that the inaccuracies of recall may be of minor significance, but to me, it's unsettling. We have no way of knowing how accurately the teachings of Jesus were remembered. Thus, the Gospels fade even further into the unreliable territory of hearsay. 4, pseudepigrapha, falsely inscribed. The Gospels were named for Jesus' disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, conveying the impression that they were the actual witnesses. However, there was a fashion at the time for people to attribute their writing to some famous person, to give their writing credibility. Such writings are called pseudepigrapha, or falsely inscribed. Given that the Gospels were written so long after the fact, makes it certain that they were in fact pseudepigrapha. That custom makes authenticating authorship problematic. We would like for the Gospels to have been written by authoritative sources, but we don't know who actually wrote them or what qualified them to render a reliable account. The situation is not reassuring. 5, oral transmission favors what makes a good story. As the record of Jesus and his teachings weren't written until long after the fact, it was originally transmitted orally as retold stories. The technical term for that is folklore. Those who study folklore know that when a story is retold, the teller will inevitably, if not even deliberately, distort the story in order to make it more interesting. The teller will highlight certain aspects of the story by filling in detail that wasn't there to begin with, and by leaving out other detail thought to be incidental or not contributing to the point being made. Certain aspects of the story are exaggerated or at least accentuated in order to give it more audience appeal. For the teller, it may be a simple matter of honest logical supposition, but the process is nevertheless imaginative. If the teller is not interested in accurate history, but only in telling an engaging story, then a more active creative process occurs. The audience is certainly part of this process because the audience rewards a good storyteller. The audience at the time of Jesus was one predisposed to the magical, and thus elicited such stories about Jesus. Of course, all these problems get magnified when a story is retold by subsequent storytellers, the well-known telephone game effect. Granted, there may have been those who were trustworthy in faithfully retelling the stories of Jesus. I feel uneasy, though, about accepting the authenticity of spiritual teachings from a line of storytellers. 6, language, culture, and time are formidable barriers. Anyone who has spent much time with another culture and language knows that communication barriers abound. All cultures hold their own particular worldview, which is represented by various symbols, primarily metaphors and myths. We are very far removed from the culture, time, and place of Jesus. Today, we have a vastly different worldview and use a much different set of concepts to represent that worldview. It seems pretty audacious to me to reliably piece together a highly unusual and complicated story from a distant foreign culture with limited and faulty documentation, and from the perspective of our modern belief in symbology some 2,000 years after the fact. I don't doubt that we missed the mark by a significant margin. 7, lost in translation. Anyone acquainted with another language recognizes that there is virtually no exact equivalent between even the common words of two languages. Also, because languages differ in their implications about the nature and structure of reality, as well as how much should be made verbally explicit, translators necessarily find themselves in the awkward position of having to interpolate an author's intended meaning. This is the dirty little secret of translation. There are usually passages that a translator misunderstands or cannot understand at all, even after extensive research. Translators unavoidably, even if unintentionally, introduce distortion into an author's intended meaning because it is filtered not just through the translator's agenda, but more importantly, through the translator's unconscious beliefs and perceptions. If it is filtered through a religious agenda, then it's a theological translation. A translation that is colored by and supports the translator's theology. We get the New Testament only in theological translation, twice. First from Aramaic to Greek, and then from Greek into English. except for the Gospel of Luke, which comes from Greek. Unfortunately, we do not have any of the original Aramaic documents with which to check the translation accuracy. Speaking as a supervising scientific linguist who has worked in a translation office with multiple languages, I am uncomfortable with a two-generation translation. There is just too much opportunity for misperception and misinterpretation to slip in. Number 8, copy error happens. Originally, of course, there were no printing presses. What was written by hand. The parchments on which the writings were originally made deteriorated with use and age and had to be recopied manually. The reality is, accidentally or intentionally, copy error happens. The originals are now entirely gone. What survives today is the result of multiple generations of copies of copies. Careful comparison of the various old manuscripts that remain reveals some copy error, although it is impossible to assess how much distortion has been introduced by such error. Number 9, the disciples themselves didn't get it. The hearers' unconscious filtering and thereby misperception of Jesus' teachings is a much more serious source of distortion than hearsay, bad memory, storytelling, mistranslation, or copy error. The teachings of Jesus were radical, beyond the grasp of his disciples. There are several references in the existing record to their inability to understand his message. What he taught and what they understood are likely two different things. Jesus couched his public message in parable and figures of speech, which effectively disguised it from those ready to stone him for blasphemy. But even in his private teachings, all the disciples seemed capable of hearing was what their prior beliefs predisposed them to. Jesus went well beyond those beliefs, and consequently, I believe his essential message was lost on them. Through their record, we don't get it either. Number 10, the books were cooked. Another major source of distortion of Jesus' teachings came in the 4th century AD. The Roman emperor at the time, Constantine, had an empire comprised of various pagan groups, plus several disparate Christian sects that had been increasing in popularity and disruptiveness. In order to keep his empire under control, Constantine mandated a single religion. Though he himself was not Christian at the time, he decreed that religion to be Christianity. The problem was, however, there was no consensus on what constituted Christianity. He therefore created a council of existing Christian leaders in 325 AD at Nicaea in Greece, directing them to settle their differences and to codify their result. This the council did through a difficult and factious political process, calling the dogma codified as the Nicene Creed that was sufficiently ambiguous to achieve consensus. This credo has been the litmus test of Christianity ever since. There is evidence that the Gospels were altered to reflect the credo. And as it turns out, the credo is suffused with mythic imagery from the ambient Egyptian, Babylonian, Greek, and Roman mythologies of Constantine's empire. There is evidence that the Gospels were altered also to reflect those images. Number 11, missing Gospels. At the time, there were many written Gospels or sayings of Jesus floating about, perhaps as many as 100. At the conclusion of this Council of Nicaea, all those records, save 4, were systematically collected and destroyed. The remaining 4 were those that best supported the conclusions of Nicaea. They were further doctored to generally harmonize, though they still don't exactly, then canonized as the Gospels that we now have in the New Testament. Today, of course, we have found a few surviving copies of other Gospels that didn't make it into the Bible, and they do differ from the canon in important ways. But we still do not know how reliable those other Gospels are, and we'll never know what we're missing. Number 12, other worldviews. Much of core Christian belief today is not from the actual teachings of Jesus, but is literalized pagan mythology. I know that may be a radical statement. This is well documented. Such as Jesus as the Virgin Mother and as the Son of the Virgin Mother, of course, and the only begotten of God. This trope of someone being the child of a virgin has been used in other mythologies and other cultures in order to deify their main character. Original sin. Jesus as an intercessor with God and savior of mankind. The eating of his flesh and drinking of his blood as a sacrament. There are others, I'll not go on. Each one of these elements is derived from multiple antecedents in pagan mythologies. In sum, all this taken together make the New Testament a dubious document at best from which to draw any definite conclusions about God. I grant that there are many inspiring points of light in the New Testament, but nevertheless, it's a record which we should consider not literally, but provisionally and metaphorically, with the very best discernment that we can muster. So, did Jesus say explicitly that God is a person? There's no indication of that. Do Christians believe that the Father who Jesus spoke of is the God of the Old Testament? Yes, generally. And that Father God is the all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving one, the creator of heaven and earth and everything therein, including you, the judge of your life, the one who holds your eternal fate in his hands. So is that the one? So we'll get to that. We'll move on now and look at the God we find in the Old Testament. In Judaism, the God of the Old Testament is known as Yahweh or Jehovah, the God of Israel who made a covenant with Abraham and revealed the Torah to Moses. In Christianity, the God of the Old Testament is also known as Yahweh or Jehovah and is seen as the same God who revealed himself through Jesus Christ in the New Testament. In Islam, the God of the Old Testament is known as Allah, the same God worshipped by Jews and Christians, and is believed to have revealed the Quran to the Prophet Muhammad. It's important to note that different religions have different beliefs and interpretations about God, and the nature and attributes of God are the subject of ongoing theological debate and inquiry. But to characterize the God of the Old Testament, here are some depictions of the behavior of that God. In Genesis 6, the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals, to creeping things, to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. Behold, even I am bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life. From under heaven, everything that is in and on the earth shall perish. Genesis 19. When the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he threw those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew. I said threw, I meant overthrew, and what grew on the ground. And in Deuteronomy 7, When the Lord your God brings you into the land where you are entering to possess it, and clears away many nations before you, 7 nations greater and stronger than you, and when the Lord your God delivers them before you, and you defeat them, you shall utterly destroy them. You shall show no favor to them. Deuteronomy 20. Only in the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. You shall utterly destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 1 Samuel. And now go and strike Amalek and utterly destroy all that he has. Do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Exodus 21, in Exodus 21, we learn that it's okay to beat your slaves if you don't kill them. Leviticus 21, in what should be good news for some religious conservatives, God really does hate people who are different from the norm. Of course, God isn't as worried about skin color or sexual orientation as he is about whether you're ugly. Here are the people God does not want coming to worship him. People with blemishes, the blind, the lame, dwarfs, people with scurvy, people with bad eyes, people with bad skin. The Old Testament paints the picture of God as nothing more than a cosmic bully with a hair trigger who is ready to torture or end the lives of anyone who so much as neglects a seemingly small request of his. There are many more examples, so I think that's enough to give the flavor of it all. So, was the God of the Old Testament the God of Jesus, the Lord of love? Though Christian theologians have struggled mightily with this glaring disconnect, twisting and turning to reconcile it, we might agree that those two images of God are, in fact, irreconcilable. To unpack this, let's start by looking at the word for God in the Old Testament. The Hebrew word is Elohim. That is the word used throughout the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, in Hebrew, and the Christian Bible. But that word is problematic. Even though it is translated as God in the singular, it is grammatically plural. The ending "im" is the plural ending, just like S in English makes a word plural. Literally, Elohim means the mighty ones, in the plural. Next slide. In recent years, Vatican theologians decided they wanted a modern and accurate translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew. And for their translator, they hired an Italian scholar, Mauro Biglio. Biglio found the word Elohim was not only itself in the plural form, but the verbs that went with it were also in grammatical agreement, the plural. And the word's use in context also showed pluralness. Thus, Biglio, committed to strict faithfulness to the source text, translated Elohim as gods with an S. The Vatican was not happy with this solution. They wanted a theological translation, God in the singular, so they fired Biglio. Biglio's translation was not a new discovery. Elohim is a complex and multifaceted term that has been the subject of much interpretation and debate throughout Jewish and Christian history. Some scholars have suggested that it may reflect an earlier polytheistic belief system or a divine council of multiple gods. At this point, the title of my presentation changes from "Who is God?" to "Who were the gods of the Old Testament?" Click. So the Old Testament story does not begin in Israel or even earlier in Egypt. It begins before that in Sumer. The existence and character of Sumer has emerged in our understanding only in the past 100 years. Sumer was a cluster of city-states in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia being a Greek name meaning between rivers. And these are the two rivers. And this is Mesopotamia, this area here. The northern river is the Tigris or Tigris, and the southern river is Euphrates. You may recall that Abraham, the great patriarch of both the Hebrews and the Arabs, came from the city of Ur. One of the great cities of Sumer was right on the mouth of the Euphrates River, right there. Sumer has been called the cradle of civilization so much because so much of our modern culture derives directly from it. Anciently, the area was not a desert. The climate was different and the land was verdant. Click. Sumer was part of what's been called the Fertile Crescent, extending up from Mesopotamia down through Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel, sometimes considered to go also into Egypt. But there is a big mystery about Sumer, which is, how could the local indigenous culture turn from goat herding and almost overnight become a fully articulated, sophisticated, modern civilization? Without antecedents, without developmental period. It violates our generally accepted notion of gradual evolutionary development. Furthermore, the successive cultures in Mesopotamia did not continue Sumer's advanced development, but retrogressed. It is a singular anomaly. Joseph Campbell, the comparative mythologist, wrote, "With stunning abruptness, at a crucial date that can be almost precisely fixed at 3200 BC, there appears in this little Sumerian mud garden, as though the flowers of its tiny cities were suddenly bursting into bloom, the whole cultural syndrome that has since constituted the general geminal unit of all of the high civilizations of the world. And we cannot attribute this event to any achievement of the mentality of simple peasants, nor was it the mechanical consequence of the simple piling up of material artifacts economically determined. It was actually and clearly the highly conscious creation of the mind and science of a new order of humanity, which has never before appeared in the history of mankind." This much can be asserted with complete assurance, end quote. So this mystery is not just dusty history. It has direct, important relevance for us today, as I will attempt to show, is actually a key that unlocks not only the God mystery, but many perplexities of our modern life. So let's look at it. Slide. This slide shows the overlay of the modern political entities. Here's Iraq here, and here's Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. And I also meant to note that, never mind, we'll move on. So I'd like to list some anachronisms of Sumer, that is, aspects, features of the Sumerian culture that are out of place in their time. There are many. There's advanced agriculture, horticulture, the breeding of new plant varieties, the domestication and husbandry of animals, land transport using wheeled carts, wagons, water transport using boats, sails, oars, wharves, navigation, culinary arts, wine and beer making, textiles, weaving, clothing, tailoring, woodworking, leatherworking, ceramics, brick firing, masonry, brick and stone construction, stone quarrying, and forming, transporting, and positioning in structures, including very large stones, some larger than we have the ability to move today. Metals, many different kinds of metals, metal smelting, metallurgy, metal implements, saws, nails, hinges, pins, axe heads, arrowheads, etc. And a new language. I'm just throwing up this language tree of the Semitic language family. You see, Akkadian is the language spoken by the indigenous people, named after the Sumerian city Akkad. But Sumer had a new language that was superimposed over Akkadian, and we'll call that Sumerian language. But it does not occur, it is not a Semitic language. So you see, Hebrew is is later in time than Akkadian, part of an Ugaritic family of languages or group. So the new language, Sumerian, was an isolate. It had no antecedents, no relatives or descendants. There was, however, the pre-existing language was Akkadian. So Sumer was bilingual, and the two languages were not related. Slide. It's a writing system. A system of writing is a social convention that does not inhere innately in a language. There are many different symbols and symbol systems that can be used to write any given language. The point is, among world languages, it is relatively rare that a culture will have a system for writing their language. Of the approximately 5,000 languages in the world today, hardly 50 have traditionally been written. In modern times, of course, writing systems have been developed for many other languages that were previously not written. So Sumerian had a writing system. Mathematics is another feature. Sumer used both base 10 and base 60 numbering systems. Not only measurements and calculations, but geometry, algebra, trigonometry, land surveying, geography. And the base 60 numbering system survives in our use today as 60 seconds in a minute and 60 minutes in an hour. And a nautical mile being 1/60th of a degree of latitude. Sumer had standard weights and measures, including 360 degrees of radial division. They had architecture and construction. Many types of buildings were used. They had money. They had commerce, markets, merchants. They had an urban culture. They had urban, services, like water and sewer. Next slide. Here's one of their buildings. You've seen them, ziggurats, pyramids. They had a governmental system, bicameral legislature, chief executive, taxation, tax collection. They had a legal system, codified civil and criminal law, process, administration, enforcement, courts, judges, juries, jails, records, politics, foreign and domestic policy, social engineering, and foreign relations. Next. Here's an example. of some of their writing. I'll get to that in a minute. They had a military, defensive structures, weapons, tactics, etc. Educational system. They had the arts, including music using the diatonic scale, the same scale we use today in the West. Musical instruments, etc. And the visual arts, sculpture, drama, dance, acrobatics, entertainments. They had science, mainly petrochemistry, medicine, pharmacopoeia, diagnosis, prescription, surgery. They had, the last feature and most astonishing, astronomy. They divided the heavens into 12 sectors, which notion survives as our zodiac. They made a distinction between planets and stars, which was a distinction long coming in Western culture. They had a knowledge of planetary spin and a heliocentric model of the solar system, which Europe didn't get until 1543. They had a knowledge of the outer planets, Neptune, Uranus, Pluto, which was discovered by Western astronomers in the 1800s. And they had a knowledge of the period of our planet's wobble cycle, also called the axial precession. When you spin a top, you've noticed how it wobbles. The top will wobble like this. The axis will not stay steady. Well, the axis of our planet also wobbles. Right now, our axis is pointing at the star Polaris, which we call the North Star. That allows us to fix north. But over time, our axis will wander off that direction as it wobbles. Now, the period of time for a complete cycle of axial precession is 25,800 years. Sumer had that number. Yes, sir. There's no mic there.
Can you hear me? Quick question. Was this in parallel with Egypt, all the advances in Egypt, or before or after, or what?
That is a very interesting question. There are many parallels with Egypt, also with the Indus Valley and what we would today consider to be civilization. The appearance on the scene of any of the above features alone would be surprising, but taken together, they form a picture totally astonishing and inexplicable from our modern view of slow evolutionary development, particularly stunning. Have the extreme clarity of vision that we do of Sumer because of these records. They tell of rulers, laws, commercial transactions, inventories, deeds, wills, histories, mythologies, speeches, genealogies, stories, forms of worship, school lessons, mathematics, science, measurements, etc., etc. The arresting and inescapable question begged by all these features of advanced civilization is, how could this be? It confounds our deeply held assumptions about how life on our planet has evolved. To solve this mystery, I invite you, gentle listener, to carefully consider the entire body of evidence, eliminate no possibility, inquire within without prejudice, and see what your own insight may discover. What you find may be nothing short of an epiphany. So let's assume from all its attainments that Sumer was lest we assume from all its attainments that Sumer was an enlightened society, the unfortunate truth is that it was not. It was a slave state. There were two distinct races of Sumerians, the masters and the slaves, which meant that its culture was very hierarchical and very authoritarian, a highly controlled society. At the society's pinnacle were the power elite, a family with incredible power. Next slide. Okay, next. Next. Oh dear. Try as we might. Glitches happen. Okay, stop there. The Sumerian city-states were furthermore in continuous armed conflict with each other. Their magnificent cities were continually attacked and destroyed. Internecine war was endemic. They were not immune to social dysfunction, materialism, greed, lying and cheating, etc. In effect, the whole panoply of social dysfunction that we know today. We are the heirs to that culture. The key to unlocking the mystery of Sumer and the answer to who were the gods of Sumer lies in understanding who the ruling elite were. We know something of these masters from the cuneiform record and by piecing together bits and pieces from multiple sources. Yes, ancient Sumer had features of civilization it should not have had. Its advancement cannot be explained by indigenous evolutionary development. Those advancements were, in fact, not developed, but received. So who were the Elohim, the mighty ones, the gods of Sumer? From the Sumerian record, we learn that the elite masters of Sumer were a family. The name of this family was, next. Oh, did we skip something? Let's go back. Oh, well, I've lost it. We'll just leave it here. Thank you. Yeah, the name of this family was Anunnaki. The great patriarch of the family was Anu, and Anunnaki in Sumerian means the family of Anu. And I had a family tree to show you, but we can't find it. It's disappeared somehow. Anu himself was polygamous. He had many children, huge family. Some of his sons are well known today. One of them was Enki, E-N-K-I. Another was Enlil, E-N-L-I-L. And Enki, this family is so powerful that the stories of the family have persisted throughout other cultures and other mythologies. So these family members are also known by other names. Enki also known as Ptah, Vishnu, Poseidon, Enlil, also known as Bel, Zeus, Odin, and Shiva. One of his daughters was Ninhursag, a master geneticist. We'll not get into that. That's a big story. But it was a big family. There were many, many offspring and much intermarriage within the family. Some notable grandsons were Marduk, also known as Bel and Ra, and Nannar, a great granddaughter, also known as, Nannar. I'm thinking of someone else. Nannar is also known as Ares and Mars. Then there were great grandsons, Sargon and Gilgamesh, who you've probably heard of, and the world famous great granddaughter, Inanna, the goddess of the feminine, known in Akkadian as Ishtar, in Greek as Aphrodite, to the Romans as Venus, and by the Hebrews as Lilith. Inanna was the one who built the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which were later destroyed by her cousin Marduk. This family ruled most of the populated world, which they divided up among themselves. They divided up not only Mesopotamia, but the Indus Valley in present-day India, Egypt, and Mesoamerica. In the remaining evidence, there are many parallels between these ancient cultures. But to the point here, the Anunnaki were interlopers who used the indigenous peoples as slaves to extract earth resources. They had advanced technological power. They overwhelmed the indigenous peoples with their power and brought many features of their civilization into use to make their slaves more productive. The Anunnaki were intimidatingly large and tall people. Let's see if we can go back one. There we go, yeah. They were also called giants. They had advanced medical technology and lived very long lives. After ruling for many years, and for unknown reasons, the Anunnaki withdrew from Sumer. Because they were such a major influence throughout the world, stories of them survive in many mythologies around the world. Here are some mentions of the Anunnaki in the Hebrew story that we have in the book of Genesis. Genesis 6. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. That's kind of a typical slaveholder operation, isn't it? In Genesis 6, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. Here's a new term, Nephilim. Notice the plural ending. And also this I'm quoting from Genesis 6. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So Nephilim in Hebrew means those who came down from above. The fact that this bas-relief image of a Nephilim with wings is not to be taken literally. Wings are simply symbolic of how people thought it was possible to move through space from above. Today, even in our own culture, of course, we depict angels with wings. The Anunnaki had other means of movement that are lost on us today. Next. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm a little jumbled here because of this slide mix-up. The offspring of the Nephilim were held as special in the Sumerian society. They were the entitled ones. The Anunnaki themselves apparently grew weary of directing the administrative work of their slaves, so they authorized certain of their offspring to be their representatives. These became the kings and priests. Here we see the origin of our concept of divine right of kings. Some of the indigenous were also empowered further down the hierarchy as the various administrators, but at the bottom of the power pyramid was a large population of the indigenous slave workers, the Akkadian Semites. All its social organization, law, regulation, religion, and political narrative comprised a comprehensive control agenda, deliberately designed to keep the slave state in place. This too is what Western civilization has inherited in various forms, for better or for worse. But that would be a worthy topic for another time. So let's see what the indigenous slaves we see that to the indigenous slaves, the Anunnaki were gods. This explains the plural form of the Hebrew word Elohim, as that's been translated as God in the singular, to conform to the translation's theology. And those so-called gods relished the approbation and servility of their slaves. But as we've seen, despite their high technology, the Anunnaki themselves were not godlike in the divine sense. Does this remind you of anyone? High tech? They treated their slaves like kept farm animals. This explains the outrageous behavior of the so-called God of the Old Testament. Many of the same stories that are found in Sumerian cuneiform record are also found in various forms in ancient Egypt, Indus Valley, and in the Hebrew stories, which we hold today as Holy Scripture. The surviving reflections of this dysfunctional family appear in the Greek and Roman pantheons of their dysfunctional gods. It's interesting to compare the parallels that we find in the existing Sumerian histories and the Hebrew stories. So let's look at some of these comparisons. So the comparable word for the Hebrew God in the Sumerian record translates as master. And the comparable word in Hebrew for worship comes out in Sumerian as work for. Now that makes sense, doesn't it, given the slave culture of the time. Okay, next slide. Here's some more comparisons. In Hebrew, I am the Lord your God. In Sumerian, I am your master. Hebrew, you shall have no other gods before me. Sumerian, you are to work only for me, not for my brothers or cousins. Here we find the probable origin of Hebrew monotheism, the singular God. The slaves that are working for one master, not for the brothers or cousins. Now, which of these two versions should we take as authoritative? The Hebrew version was oral tradition until it was written 3,000 years later. We already talked about the telephone game effect and the distortions introduced by folklore. So, of the two versions, which would you prefer to put your trust in? I'll just leave that. The Hebrew story must have evolved considerably over time and lost much of its literal accuracy. For example, the Hebrew creation story of Adam and Eve in the garden are no doubt, the story no doubt comes from a true event, but whatever that event actually was is now virtually lost on us. And it makes no sense to try to salvage literal meaning from the remaining scraps in the Hebrew myth. Unawares to us today, the patterns established by these gods strongly influence human affairs today. These intruders were, of course, not gods in the spiritual sense and are not worthy of our allegiance, our worship, or our devotion. Their legacy includes serious social problems that vex us today: hierarchical organization, authoritarianism, racism, elitism, social manipulation, multiple forms of social control, including slavery, which still exists today in multiple forms. What we want now is to turn our attention from these so-called gods and their earthly scions to create the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. Slide. So, the picture I have sketched today is only a small part of the Anunnaki story. There is a lot more. I don't have the background or chops to go much further. I've connected some of the main dots here for you. We, of course, don't know everything about Sumer, but we know a lot more than what I've presented today. So, who is God, and who or what is God actually? Well, you know, that's the great mystery, and I don't presume to answer that mystery. That would make a worthy presentation in the future, I'm sure. But at least I think we can be sure that we know who God is not. Or, next slide, to put it more precisely, who were the Anunnaki? Thank you. That concludes my presentation. I leave you to ponder this question. And I'd be happy to entertain questions and comments. Please come to a microphone and speak right into the microphone. I'm not guaranteeing that I've got any good answers.
Well, this isn't really a question. This is a archaeological fact that I'm going to set straight about the history pre-Sumer. I just actually Googled a whole bunch of things, but Sumer didn't just arise out of nothing. There was Katahoyok, 2,000 years prior, the largest, earliest Neolithic settlement that had a much more egalitarian, feminine to masculine. They had horticulture. It was a huge group of peoples. There was Göbekli before that, which is just almost Upper Paleolithic. We don't know that much about Göbekli, at least I don't, because that's not my expertise, is Upper Paleolithic. And in the Upper Paleolithic, I just got to say, because nobody seems to know this, they were creating very, very advanced textiles in the weaving of dress and headgear. The Willendorf Venus is wearing a cap, actually, and this is well documented at Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, where they did some research on the very first kilns. So clay was being fired, but they weren't making wares. They were actually making statuary. And in a lot of those clay figurines, they found, much like the cuneiform text, they found indentations. And when Olga Sofer, an archaeologist who did the work on this, looked at this closely, what she discovered is that this was actually the weaving of knots. So 23,000 years ago was the first time textiles were built and kilns were used. My point being, Sumer didn't just get this technology by Atlantis, although maybe they did, but it was also in Europe 23,000 years ago and in Russia. So parts of Europe, Russia, all throughout the basically Europe and parts of Asia, Northern Asia.
Thank you. Dan, could you bring up the last slide? Okay, Martha, you're up.
Oh, well, that's okay. I won't take it personally. It's probably a good exercise in ego reduction to be muted from time to time. Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you so much, Robert. So I was looking stuff up, and I love this stuff about Sumer and Göbekli Tepe and just human history in general. But so I was pulling up the Law of One at the Law of One info, and just to further muddy the waters, Don Elkin says, so he's saying to Ra, when did Yahweh act to perform these genetic changes that Yahweh performed? And Ra says, I am Ra. The Yahweh group worked with those of the planet you called Mars 75,000 years ago in what you would call the cloning process. Which is great. There are differences, but they lie in the future of your space-time continuum, so we can't break the law of confusion. In other words, he can't say, because that would be breaking the confidentiality. So he says 2,600 years ago, approximately, was the second time, 3,600 years ago, approximately, the second attempt by the Orion group, the negative, to come in and mess things up with, and that's when the Anak were impregnated with new genetic material. The point being they're trying to increase our genetic ability to appreciate the law of one and have higher ascendant abilities. So it's just goes to show you they've been messing with us for a really long time.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Part of the Anunnaki story is that they did genetic manipulation of our race.
Right, yeah. Fuckers, right.
I didn't want to get into
Sorry.
that. Oh, so if anyone would like a list of the references that I've used for this presentation, feel free to email me and I'll send you my bibliography.
I'm Sarah, and I want to thank you for talking about this subject. I became very interested in it about 4 years ago. So I found all kinds of interesting things, including an animated rock opera of the Anuna Elish. However, it's in Portuguese, but it's pretty interesting. This whole story animated in Portuguese. But at any rate, I also appreciate your comments about slavery and how we are still dealing with these issues from thousands of years ago from this culture. And I wanted to let people know that I've been going through my old records, and I found something really good from the National IONS meeting that I went to in 2005. And there's papers back here to share, but it's from the spiritual politics. This is Gordon Davidson and Corrine McLaughlin. And it's about what you can do to create a better world spiritually and within the active work of the world. So if you're interested, these sheets are back here. But I also wanted to comment that I was listening to the Tom Hartman program yesterday, and he had a man on there who was talking about how the brain changes when you become a powerful person and becomes more sensitive to certain hormones, and people become less empathic when they become powerful. And so I went and I looked up this man, and he's got an interesting business, I believe, in New Zealand. But apparently, when we talk about changing things genetically, we all think of, what is it, Cas9, whatever it is, you go directly into the cell. Well, they're doing it with vibration. So this is something new and, something to be aware of, because if we're talking about people thousands of years ago changing us genetically, how did they do it? And it may be possible to do it without little pipettes and magnifying things dramatically. I want to share that with something I found out yesterday, and you can find that video on YouTube.
Thank you. All right, Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike. Robert and I are neighbors, and I often come over to their house for dinner. But Robert, excellent presentation. And Robert and I have had a lot of talks on his porch. And one of the things that I really respect is his discipline. And is it etymologist? Or what's your
Linguistics?
Linguistics, yeah. It's because I just believe deeply in getting to the source. And I appreciate how Robert has framed this discussion. One of the things that I'm really encouraged by is when, as far as the New Testament and the things that would, challenge it. I mean, there are so many like seemingly contradictions and really hard messages in the Old or New Testament. I don't know about any of you, but I kind of grew up in a religious tradition, kind of a faith-based Protestant stuff. And I've been deeply impacted in my walk with Jesus. And one of the things I'm really encouraged by is that point number 9, where it says the disciples didn't get it. I was reading John 13, one of the Gospels, and it said, Jesus, when he knew he was about to be crucified, he began to wash the disciples' feet. And to me, that is an astounding message, because Jesus was saying, hey, I came to serve you. And that is one of the reasons I follow him, is because that, I think there is something there in what Robert's calling out. I don't, he's schooling me on the Sumar and all that, and I'm really intrigued by it. But it's really interesting that there is a mystery between who Jesus is and was, and if he rose again, what he came to do, and the God of the Old Testament, because Jesus, how he talked about the Father and God. There's a lot to explore there. And a book that's helped me is called Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I don't know if you've ever heard of C.S. Lewis, but anyway, I'm just really fascinated by all this. And I think Robert is elevating the conversation for us to have to go deeper in these things. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mike. As to teachings of Jesus that the disciples didn't get, when you consider the entire record, bits and pieces here and there, the picture that emerges is that Jesus was a non-dualist. This is a pretty sophisticated spiritual understanding that does not exist in Christianity today. It exists in some Eastern religions, of course.
I'd just like to mention to anybody online, if you have a question, just raise your hand electronically and I'll open you up.
Just another little thing to muddy the water, give you something to think about. This comes from a longer story, which I won't trouble you all with. But when Atlantis was presented to me, it was not presented to me as a place. I understand today the scientists have like 5 different locations being held as possible places for Atlantis. Atlantis, when it was presented to me, was a state of being, which is why you would have accelerated cultures in many different places, because it's not a place, it's a state of being. Something to think about.
I have a little postscript for whatever it's worth. So in the Hebrew record, we can see Anunnaki as coming down from above. The ancient Hindu record records aerial vehicles in which the Anunnaki transited between heaven and earth. These vehicles were called vimanas. Vimana is described as a flying palace or chariot with the ability to travel long distances. The word Vimana comes from the Sanskrit meaning measuring out or traversing. Vimanas are described as having a circular or triangular shape, are said to be equipped with advanced technology and weapons. The texts mentioned that they were powered by engines called Shakti and were able to move through the air, on land, and underwater. The descriptions of Vimanas vary in different texts. They're generally described as having multiple levels or decks with luxurious interiors adorned with precious gems and metals. The Vimanas were said to be piloted by skilled pilots and were used by kings and gods for travel and warfare. See also the chariots of the gods.
Mark has a question online. Mark, unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious about Eric von Daniken, if some of his research jives with some of your research, or if you're
Definitely.
on opposite tracks.
Oh, yes. Yeah, totally concurrent. In my opinion, von Daniken is really on the right track. I think he's a little off in some of his guessing, but we'll forgive him that. The main story is generally correct. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about him? Okay.
Sally, you unmuted yourself. Did you
It
want
was
to say
yeah,
something?
it was just a lot of.
Go ahead, Mark.
No, I was just saying that a lot of the discussion or presentation parallels some of his work, so that's why I brought up the question about Eric von Daniken.
I've got another little tidbit I can throw out here. According to the Center for Theological Inquiry, in response to a NASA contract, they find about 287 references to UFOs in the Bible that are not, of course, called UFOs in the Bible. There are 70 references to clouds as vehicles, 15 to pillars as vehicles, 10 to dwellings as vehicles, 116 light and fiery vehicles, 22 dark and shining vehicles, 17 spinning wheels, and 37 flying furnaces and burning bushes. Whatever they are. But it's been happening for a long time. That's
everything but a partridge in a pear tree, right? Everything but a partridge in a pear tree. Robert, thank you very much. I'm not asking, I'm here to ask a question. I want to know what are your comments on, first, it's amazing to me you've given a talk largely about the Anunnaki without mentioning Zecharia Sitchin.
Oh, yes.
And so
the Jewish scholar Zecharia Sitchin is one of the main sources on this whole topic. He was born and raised in Azerbaijan.
Mm-hmm.
As a Jewish boy, he was sent to yeshiva where he studied the Hebrew story.
Right.
And he later emigrated to Israel and had a profession as a journalist. But his main passion in life was Sumer. This is the way it happened. When he was in yeshiva and they were reading Genesis, and they came across this passage in Hebrew that the Nephilim were coming down to the sons of, or the daughters of men, right? So Sitchin says, Rabbi, Nephilim, those who came down from above, what's up with this?
Right.
And the rabbi essentially says, shut up, kid, and just listen to the lecture here. But that event caused Sitchin to have a burning desire to get to the bottom of this story. And he did extensive research. He learned German and French so he could read the scientific journals. He studied cuneiform, is able to read it to some degree. And he unpacked a lot of this mystery. And he's written about a dozen books that lay it all out. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, some of his work, some of his speculation is just that, but nevertheless, from channeling information, if to whatever extent channeling is reliable, I've gotten a lot of confirmation of the core of his work being accurate.
Excellent. Yeah, I would say, I would agree with that, that some of his stuff is speculative.
Right.
But the core message is solid.
The core being that the Anunnaki came here from another planet in search of gold.
Exactly.
And needed dumb slave mules to mine the gold for them because it was too hard for them to do.
Yep.
And that's where we come in.
The record is pretty clear.
Right. So,
it's not speculative. Speculation.
Now, what about Joseph Atwill's work?
Not familiar with
Caesar's Messiah.
Not familiar with that.
It's a book that came out 25 years or so ago, and the idea was that the Romans commissioned the Flavian emperors, who were the Titus, and it was the three of them. I can't remember. Titus was the general who was at the Masada and all that. That after the Masada, the siege in Israel, they wanted something to pacify the Jews, and so they commissioned the writing of Matthew, Mark, and Luke to create a pacifist, heroic figure for the Jews, so they wouldn't be so warlike anymore.
Yeah, interesting. I can't comment on that.
I know. I mean, but it is an interesting idea, even if the stories were made up for that purpose, they were still based on actual stories that were going on about teachings that were going on at that time. So
well, we see a lot of religious politics going on, at the very least.
Right. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, welcome.
And I second the applause for your using your linguistic skills. I forgot to mention that in my introduction, but Robert's main occupation in life is as a linguist. Is that correct? Yeah. And so this was a wonderful demonstration of how linguistics can be a source of learning for all of us. Thank you. All right, folks, I think that's the end of our day for the day. We've got next month, hold on, I've got to go find my flyer. I'm gonna put this one down and I'll go to the next one. Next month is our June meeting. We will have Melissa Gates Perry, who is a Vermont-based channel and author of a wonderful book called Being Humans, which is co-authored between her and her spirit guide, whose name is Aralam. And there's some fabulous information in the book, and look forward to it. Also want to announce that on the 17th of June will be our annual Spring Fling with our house band, who is Dan O'Neill and Company, and that will be, weather permitting, will be in the backyard at my house at 525 Sleepy Hollow Road. Everyone's invited, and bring a friend and potluck, and we'll send a flyer out for that as well. But I want to remind everybody today who's either here in person or online. So, and we've also got a wonderful summer of things lined up. In July, we have Howard Beatty, who is going to talk about his book, The ETs Speak. In August, we have Elia Wise, who is the author of the classic Letter to Earth, and then we've got wonderful stuff after that. So thanks for coming. Come on back, and we hope to see you next month. And right now we have potluck for those who are here in person who have braved the world to come out in the post-COVID era and eat and share food with friends and family. Thank you.